Okay, so this is going to be a video on Aristotle and moral rules. So, but it won't really be only on Aristotle. Everything I say here is going to apply pretty much to Plato. What I'm going to describe, what I'm going to attribute to Aristotle is something that's kind of true of virtue ethicists in general, and that's what Plato and Aristotle are. They're the original virtue ethicists. It's the name of the theory that they both subscribe to. So, we have from Aristotle, last video covered the doctrine of the mean. Right? And some people have thought that the doctrine of the mean is effectively providing you a rule for how to behave. In any situation, find the extreme alternatives, rule them out, and then work your way in from the extremes to some moderate position. And that should be always what you do, the moderate action, the moderate response. But that's not what he's doing when he lays out the doctrine of the mean. He's not telling you which actions to perform. He's telling you something about the virtues. The virtues involve tendencies to have certain emotional responses, what kinds of tendencies, the moderate tendencies, because there is always going to be a way of screwing up, of responding inappropriately, either by excessive emotional response or deficient emotional response. Okay, so that's what's going on there. And it's not supposed to be applied on a case-by-case basis. It's your virtue as a whole is moderate. Which will mean in some particular cases you're going to have extreme reactions because the situation calls for it. Okay, so that's not a rule for action. Nowhere before that in the book is there a rule for action. And when he goes through the virtues, which he does in the middle of the book, he never anywhere provides a straightforward rule for action. And what you might think of as like a model for this would be something like the Ten Commandments, right? The Ten Commandments have a lot of things you're not supposed to do and some things you are supposed to do all the time, right? A bunch of thou shalt nots, right? You're not supposed to kill people. You're not supposed to, take God's name in vain. And there's some things you are supposed to do. You're supposed to honor thy mother and father, stuff like that, right? And while there is some ambiguity in the Ten Commandments, let's say, where it's not always quite clear exactly what's meant. Like a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to parse that thou shalt not kill. Like, well, it's actually thou shalt not murder. But then that kind of makes the rule of no guidance, because when you say thou shalt not murder and you say, well, murder is just wrongful killing, it's like thou shalt not kill wrongly. It's like, well, thanks for that. Kind of knew that one. But straightforward rules like don't steal, don't kill people, right? Don't hurt people for no reason. We don't get rules like that out of Aristotle. We don't get them out of Plato either. Plato and Aristotle spend all their time talking about the psychology of the virtues. They talk about the role of the virtues in a happy life. They don't ever really drill down and tell us, here's exactly what the virtuous person will do in a given situation. Here's the rule that the virtuous person follows, or the set of rules. And in Plato's case, that can sometimes seem like an oversight. It can seem like he never actually tells us, right, what we're supposed to be doing. In Plato's case, it seems to be that he's not interested in that question. Like he thinks it's pretty straightforward what counts as just or not just. And what he's asking is, all right, given that you understand what justice is, how can justice be shown to be good for you? And what's really lacking in Plato is an articulation of why it is that being rational, that having your rational part rule your soul, will lead to justice. That's what's missing. But Plato doesn't even take himself to be in the business of telling you what justice involves. Not in the Republic anyway, which is all about justice. Aristotle, though, makes it much more clear. So throughout books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle keeps sort of dropping out of the main discussion to talk about issues of methodology. And the issues of methodology come up when he, says the thing about, young people can't learn ethics, right? They're not the appropriate students. When he says that habits are good habits are necessary to become a good person. When he talks about there not be you need to have an appreciation of what level of specificity you should be going for in any discipline. Some disciplines can be more specific than others, where it's clear ethics is supposed to be one of the not quite as precise, not quite as specific disciplines. What this all boils down to is Aristotle doesn't believe there are any moral rules. Now, that's not to say, that can sound crazy because, like, what's Aristotle going to say about a rule like don't kill people? Right? Won't he agree with that? Aristotle's probably going to answer like, well, yeah, for the most part. And when you really think about it, that's your answer too. You think it's okay to kill people sometimes. In self-defense, right? If someone's actively trying to murder you, can you kill them? Most people say yeah. Defending others, if you see somebody actively trying to kill a little kid, is it okay to kill them if that's the only way to stop them? Most people say yeah. In prosecuting like a defensive war, is it okay to kill people? Most people again say yeah. Plenty of people even think it's okay to kill people for bad things they've already done. Who knows? But what Aristotle's going to say is, yeah, you've got simple rules like that. But simple rules like that always admit of counterexamples. The point he's making when he says ethics can't be that precise is that you get to a level like this, don't kill people. Something a virtuous person will agree to, but a virtuous person will also know where the exceptions are to that rule. The virtuous person will know that sometimes actually you do need to kill people. And what Aristotle thinks is ethics as an intellectual discipline is not capable of getting any more precise. Because here's what you might think you could do. You could start out with the rule, don't kill people, and then you could just start listing the exceptions. Right? You have a self-defense exception. You have the defense of others exception. And you might think you could do the following thing. You could just list all the exceptions. Or better yet, right? You could, not instead of just listing all the exceptions, you could figure out the principle that gets you the exceptions. Right? So you might think, well, the reason why it's okay to kill people in self-defense and defense of other situations is that to kill in that situation is at the same time to save a life. So you might think, well, it's okay to kill in order to save lives. But that principle itself is going to admit of exceptions, right? So consider a case where you're a doctor and you have a bunch of patients who need organs. They all need different organs. And you are doing like clinic hours, right? You have your main practice where apparently you're overseeing people who need organ transplants. But you also, you have time and you spend at the clinic where anybody can walk in. Somebody comes in complaining of a minor ailment, like they sprained their ankle and they want a little bit of pain medication for it, maybe something to help with the swelling. And you realize that they're a match for your patients. If you kill this person, cut them up, take their organs and give them to your other patients, all those other patients will live. And let's say there's 5 patients who need these organs and there's this one guy. In that case, killing that guy would save more lives. But most of us think, not allowed to do that. So it's going to be difficult. But you might think it's possible. You might think it's possible to come up with a set of principles, which when they're all taken together, will invariably lead to, or invariably tell you what the right action is. Or in other words, the way some people like to put it, is you might think that the moral laws and rules, all taken together, create an algorithm, basically, that will tell you exactly what the right action is. That moral theory can reach the precision that, say, physics gets to. Where like physical laws, the laws in physics aren't like most of the time laws, right? Like the inverse square law that governs gravity, it's not like that's true most of the time, but there are exceptions. It's like, no, this is what's true all the time. Or in the cases where it appears to be false, you can know ahead of time that it'll be false because there's like really easy to specify exceptions to it. So for example, the inverse square law doesn't quite work with two objects when like wind resistance is taken into account. So you just make the inverse square law true about objects in a vacuum. It's pretty straightforward. Physics can get really specific. And the goal of physics, the goal of any physics theory is to provide like a mathematically precise, exceptionless set of laws that describe everything that happens. And you might think morality can do the same thing. Morality can get you a set of laws which, when all taken together, always tell you the right action whenever you know enough about the situation you're concerned with. Right? Well, here's what Aristotle thinks. Ethics can never get an algorithm. Aristotle thinks, nope, there's no moral algorithm. If there was, you wouldn't have that restriction that young people can't be good students for ethics, right? Because you reach a certain age and you're able to understand the language well enough. If you're smart enough, you can learn physics, right? Like sufficiently smart people can do really high level physics when they're 15, 16, stuff like that. Presumably physics isn't going to be easier than ethics. So if there were like an ethical or moral algorithm, if there were a set of laws that we could discover that invariably told you the right thing to do, then young people could learn it. Right? And Aristotle doesn't think young people can learn it. He thinks it takes experience. He thinks it takes time. And you might think the only reason that would be true is if there isn't an algorithm. If the best we can get is these rules that are true most of the time or some of the time. But that in order to know what the exceptions are, you don't learn other principles, right? It's not like you learn the original principle, don't kill people, and then you learn the principles that specify the exceptions. What you do is you live your life and you become more and more familiar with a wider range of ethical scenarios by having lived it, and you come to develop a sense or an intuition for these things. Right? So Aristotle thinks ethics isn't in the job of telling you exactly what to do in all cases. Right? That's not how it works. Now, it's not clear that Plato thought this. Plato also believed that young people shouldn't study the good, but he only believed that because he thought you needed to do like 20 to 30 years of math first before you started studying what was truly good. So the philosopher kings, the people that ruled the city, who knew the form of the good, in order to learn the form of the good, they had to learn math first. And it seems like the reason for that is the form of the good is an object for Plato a lot like mathematical objects, presumably capable of being defined precisely. Interesting that Plato never actually defines the good precisely. He never tells us what the form of the good is. Maybe he thinks he doesn't know it yet, but Aristotle definitely thinks this. And that might make you wonder, like, well, what good is this? Right? Well, the good of it is that Aristotle's trying to reconcile morality with happiness, the same way Plato was. He's trying to provide an account of how to become a moral person, why you should want to be a moral person. He's trying to figure out the relationship between pleasure and virtue and things like that. He's also going to take the stuff he says about morality or ethics and he's going to apply it to political questions. But he's not going to sit here and tell you, here are the rules you follow, and if you follow them, you're going to be a virtuous person. That said, there is a kind of guidance that Aristotle thinks is available. And that guidance comes from other people. Virtue ethicists are traditionally committed to the idea that if you don't think you understand what justice involves, courage involves, wisdom, temperance, all these virtues, if you don't think you know what's called for in a situation in order to be a virtuous person, that what you do is you look to the virtuous person. That the best way to come to understand what the right thing to do is through the concept of the virtuous person. So the idea is we're much more able, or much better able, to create in our minds an ideal, a paradigm individual, and then to think about what would that individual do in various cases, right? So like, what would Jesus do? People ask that question thinking that if you can figure out what Jesus would do in a situation, you know what the right thing for you to do is. And the idea being that you can figure out what Jesus would do better than you can figure out on your own what the right thing to do in that particular case is. The idea is that cases are difficult. Individual cases are often very difficult. They're complicated, they're convoluted, but that we are much better able to understand people than complex moral cases or scenarios, and much more able to imagine what the good person would do in that situation or scenario. So we get to our understanding of good behavior, of right behavior, through understanding what virtuous people would do. So if you want to know what the just thing to do in a situation is, best of all, you could find a just person and ask them what they would do in that situation. Or you can imagine, you can try to hypothetically engage with the case by taking a hypothetical virtuous person and putting them in your shoes and saying, like, all right, what would they do? Because Aristotle's thought is we have a much better grasp of other human beings than we do of abstract moral facts. And so we can think our way to those abstract moral facts through our understanding of other people, particularly good people. Now, this sort of like social fact about us, that we're much better at understanding virtue when we think about virtue sort of in a person rather than in the abstract, is going to have a lot to do with what Aristotle says about friendship, which is actually going to be, in a lot of ways, the key to his whole theory. So that's what we'll cover in the next video.